A young Texas mother is brutally murdered while in the midst of a bitter custody battle. Police quickly arrest her ex-boyfriend, but there's another twist. The mastermind orchestrating the murder is really his new fiancée, a woman who plotted the murder to steal the victim's life. It all began one fall morning in Carlton, Texas, a suburb just 20 miles north of Dallas. That's where 24-year-old mom Alyssa Burkett was parked in her car, outside the Green Tree Apartments leasing office where she worked. According to witnesses, a suspect, who they believed was a black man, approached Alyssa's car. What happened next is almost too shocking to imagine. The suspect took out a gun, pulled the trigger, and shot Alyssa through the driver's side window. The suspect left her for dead, but somehow Alyssa survived. She climbed out of her car trying to get help from her coworkers inside the office, but the suspect wasn't finished. He chased her up the steps of her office, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her 44 times. The suspect then rushed from the scene driving off in a Ford SUV. At the same time, Alyssa's coworkers came outside to find her in a pool of blood. She was later pronounced dead. Alyssa's mother, Therese Collard, arrived at the scene shortly after hearing this tragic news. Right away, she told police that she knew who killed her daughter, 33-year-old Andrew Beard, who is Alyssa's ex-boyfriend. At the time of Alyssa's death, the two were involved in a messy custody battle over their one-year-old daughter, Willow. At first, investigators were skeptical about Beard's involvement because he didn't match the description witnesses had given to police. But after speaking with Beard and his fiancée, Holly Elkins, investigators soon began to suspect there was more to the story. When police searched Andrew Beard's house, they found strange evidence inside, including batteries and a charging station for a GPS tracker. Investigators say these items matched the tracker that was discovered underneath Alyssa's vehicle. What's more, a shocking discovery inside Andrew Beard's vehicle: 2 bottles of dark makeup. Investigators say he used this makeup to mask his identity, wearing blackface at the time of Alyssa's murder. Police later found the Ford SUV getaway car that witnesses had described from the scene. It had been abandoned less than a mile from Andrew Beard's home. Ultimately, he was arrested and charged with Alyssa Burkett's 2020 murder. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to killing her, but the case was far from over. When he spoke to the FBI as part of his plea deal, he dropped a huge bombshell. Beard admitted he wasn't the one who orchestrated this murder. Instead, it was his fiancée, Holly Elkins. Beard said Elkins told him exactly what to do, including the idea to wear dark makeup and disguise Beard as a black man. Ahead of Alyssa's murder, Beard began dating Elkins in April of 2020, and things progressed quickly. Later that month, Elkins spent the weekend with Beard and his daughter, and by May, the couple were shopping for engagement rings. But there was trouble in paradise. Elkins had a problem with how involved Beard was still with his ex-girlfriend. In text messages between Beard and Elkins, authorities discovered a deep-seated hatred for Alyssa. One text message from Elkins revealed her frustration when she said, quote, "Your BM, meaning baby mama, owns you. You continue to put BM first. You choose to be IDK, for lack of a better term, submissive to her. And I don't want, or need any BS from anyone." At first, Elkins tried everything to make Alyssa look unfit to be a mother. This began in June of 2020 with a campaign to terrorize Alyssa, starting with small acts of harassment that grew to more sinister things over time. Elkins and Beard secretly installed a GPS tracker on Alyssa's car, allowing them to track her every move. In July, Elkins made a fake 911 call, claiming Alyssa was driving erratically on the highway. Just weeks later, she made another false report, accusing Alyssa's mother of attacking her. Elkins went even further, hiring a private investigator to dig up information on Alyssa and her new boyfriend, but the investigator didn't find anything incriminating. As time passed, the harassment became more dangerous. In September, Elkins and Beard planted drugs and a gun in Alyssa's vehicle. Beard then called the police, accusing Alyssa of dealing drugs. But when all of these attempts failed, Elkins pushed Beard toward more violent solutions. Eventually, the harassment turned into a deadly plot to get rid of Alyssa, and by late September, the couple was planning her murder. Elkins and Beard purchased a black rain suit, dark makeup, and weapons, including shotgun shells and a knife. Elkins texted Beard urging him to, quote, "handle it," and telling him that she hoped he would be ride or die for her. She even warned him that if he did not follow through, their relationship could be over. Shortly after this exchange, Beard made a Google search for how to remove gunpowder from his hands. All this led up to October 2nd, when Alyssa Burkett was murdered. So, to make sense of this tragic case, we're hearing from criminal defense attorney and former domestic violence prosecutor Anthony Osso. Thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Thanks for having me, Sierra.
Now, this case is kind of wild, and I think it all stems from the fact that it started as two significant others. Obviously, boyfriend, girlfriend, they have a baby together. At some point, I can assume they're in love. And then all of a sudden, it becomes significant other to murderer. How does it escalate to that?
I think a lot of what caused Mr. Beard to escalate that situation is manipulation from Miss Elkins. I think that from the investigator's standpoint, they seemed to find out that she wanted this perfect life, and the only thing standing in the way of that was Miss Burkett.
I do agree with you that there was a lot of string pulling here or manipulation. It just is interesting to me that it worked. I mean, if somebody said, "Hey, I want you to kill your ex boyfriend," I think I would say no right away. Do you think there was probably a lot of convincing?
I think there was a lot of convincing, but like you said, Sierra, you can't blame this on the new fiance alone. This comes down to Mr. Beard and his willingness to actually take action um, and commit that murder. So there's a lot of undertones from him being responsible for this.
And I think a large part of this too is that they shared a child together. So there was this custody battle over their daughter. He wants her, she wants her, kind of in the middle situation, which we've seen many times before, but we don't always or even often see it lead to murder. I mean, do you think that played a role in all of this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it is um, the relationship between Mr. Beard and Miss Burkett. I think that it's indicative of a domestic violence or a relationship that involves domestic violence. And there's an element of control that Miss Burkett had over Mr. Beard, and in order to take that back, she was sort of in the way of something that he wanted as well, which again was that perfect life with his daughter and his new fiance, and she was standing in the way of that. And I think he was willing to do whatever he thought necessary to achieve having that perfect life. So I think that played a major role.
And murder is the tragic end to this. It's the worst crime you can commit. But leading up to it, I feel like there were kind of warning signs in the fact that there was a GPS tracker that was found underneath the vehicle. Things had been planted in Alyssa Burkett's car, just kind of stalking bad things. I mean, these warning signs, do you think those are important to consider?
Absolutely. And the law in Texas during murder trials actually allows for the introduction of that kind of evidence, circumstantial things that go towards the nature of the relationship. So the tracking device, the false report to the police, um, all of these things that Mr. Beard was doing leading up to the murder are relevant to take into consideration whether he was, in fact, the person that committed the crime.
Do you think that investigators would also then look into the relationship of Andrew Beard and Alyssa Burkett when they were together? Obviously, they had since broken up at the time of her death, but do you think they would kind of go back, look at the receipts, and see what all of that was about?
I think so, Sierra. Depending on how much evidence they had um, in their original investigation, I think that when they looked through the communications between Beard and Elkins, they were able to find a lot of evidence. So I don't know that they had to go back any further than that. And I do think a lot of the witnesses made it seem like the relationship was between Beard and Miss Burkett was not that turbulent. So I do think it's something they would look at. But even more so if there was not evidence later on and they needed to dig further to establish a case.
Hey, so I'm going to take a guess and say a lot of you who watch our videos are business owners or maybe even starting your own side hustle. I have to talk to you about our awesome sponsor, Odoo. It's a free all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of apps that help with the day-to-day of owning a business. One of my personal favorite Odoo apps is their project apps. There are multiple views in the project app, like the view that organizes your tasks by the stage, or another view that gives you a timeline of your tasks. It seriously makes things so simple and easy to organize. Also in the Projects app, you can directly bill customers according to time spent on tasks, which is really just a big time saver. Right now, you can click our link odoo.com/lcnews12 and try Odoo and their Projects app for free today. You brought up the messages between Holly and Andrew, the fiance, and the person who ultimately committed the crime. Okay, so these we looked through a lot of the texts and they're pretty blatant. I mean, they're discussing their plans. It's pretty much black and white right there. You can look at the texts. And I really have to wonder why they would text that information. I mean, they could have spoken to each other and then we wouldn't have a written trail of it. Why do you think that they would just have it left there on their phones?
I mean, it's the question I scratch my head and think about as a defense attorney all the time. Why would you put your crimes in writing? But the caveat to that is I always say, if you really want to know somebody or get to know somebody, go, I'm not suggesting go through their text messages, but if you looked at them, I think you would find out people's true colors. And they probably didn't anticipate that down the road, police would have the ability to look through their messages. And so they thought it was in confidence. And when you think something's in confidence, you show your true colors.
So the murder of Alyssa Burkett was obviously a shock to her, her family, her coworkers. I mean, seemingly out of the blue. But something we talk about a lot here on Law and Crime, that phrase, it's always the husband or it's
Mhm.
always the significant other. And is that who investigators would go to right away, even if they didn't have all this other information about Andrew Beard? I mean, they kind of got tipped off that potentially he could be involved. But don't they always look at the significant other first anyway?
I think if they have a reason to look at the significant other, in this situation, they had a tip from Miss Burkett's mom saying, "I know it was him." Now they're going to need a lot more than a tip from the mom and a hunch that he was responsible for this. But I think that gives them at least a lead. And so when they start lifting up the rug and looking into Mr. Beard, they see that prior call out situation. Um, and then they also were able to connect the car to him that was on the scene that witnesses saw. So I don't know that it's a necessity, but it's definitely if they have a reason to think that they're responsible, it is a place to start.
Unfortunately, this is not a crime that's new to us. Oftentimes, we see a significant other who murders the person, sometimes because of a child custody battle. I mean, it isn't completely unheard of. But what sets this case apart that you've mentioned many times is Holly Elkins. We don't always have a new fiance who's kind of pulling the strings and is the mastermind in all of this. What do you make of her role?
Um, I think it's astonishing. I mean, I think for somebody to be so fixated on um, an idea of what they think a perfect life is that they're willing to take the life of somebody else and ultimately take the life of the mother to the child that they want to treat as their own. It's astonishing. It's really not something you see all that often. You will see from time to time new partners putting pressure on their partner to treat the ex poorly and continue domestic violence, but not often to the extent of planning out and executing a murder.
One of the reasons we wanted to speak to you specifically today is because of your history with domestic violence. You know a bit about it. Do you think that there were warning signs that people around Alyssa Burkett or even she herself could have pointed to and said something may be off? Let's pay a little closer attention to.
That would rise to the level of murder. Not that I have personally seen, although um, my understanding is she did release a statement or a video that was recovered after that talked about the abuse that she'd been going through emotionally. And additionally, she told a friend that she felt that the next step after the tracking device, where he showed up at a location that she was at, she felt the next step was that he was going to get somebody to kill her. So, um, I think emotional abuse can get out of hand and it can lead to physical abuse. But I can't say that I saw or have seen anything that would lead me to think, oh, murder is the next step. I think it's a very exaggerated next step.
I think you're right. It was shocking, obviously,
Mhm.
to everyone. So that's important to note. Moving on to the charges that they eventually faced. So Andrew Beard was charged with murder and Holly Elkins with conspiracy to commit murder. Can you break those down to me? I think they're pretty self explanatory. Do you think those charges make sense?
Absolutely. Murder in Texas is pretty straightforward. It's just the unlawful um, cause of death of another person. And so, um, in this situation, it's clear that he shot her in that parking lot. And then when she went to make her way towards the inside of the apartment leasing office, he then finished the job by stabbing her. Conspiracy is a little bit more nuanced, but it's pretty simple and straightforward. It's just collaborating for somebody to execute a crime, and so it doesn't take a whole lot to ultimately be a conspirator in a criminal charge. And here, I think with the text messages and the filings beforehand and the manipulation on Miss Elkins' part, they were able to make a pretty solid case against her for conspiracy.
So we know that these two have been charged. And when prosecutors are taking a look at it, I'm wondering if they're going to highlight some important things. You just mentioned how Alyssa had been shot at the time. She got out of her vehicle, and then Andrew Beard went and stabbed her, basically to make sure that he got the job done. I mean, he didn't just shoot her and leave, he then stabbed her too. So it kind of adds an extra layer to it. Do you think that's something prosecutors would focus on?
Absolutely. I think especially when you're talking about the length of a sentence for the crime of murder. I mean, murder in any form is tragic and is unprecedented. Um, but for somebody to be fighting for their life and for you to go up behind them as they're begging for help and finish the job with a knife, which is a very intimate and personal way to kill somebody, um, prosecutors are going to take that into consideration and tack on additional punishment for those actions.
And I do feel that there's signs of consciousness of guilt in all of this too, in that he wore blackface at the time. So he was hoping to completely disguise who he was so that people wouldn't know who he was. Obviously, that shows, okay, what you're doing is wrong. Do you agree?
I agree. In addition to that, I think it shows premeditation. And that's the interesting part about the murder statute in Texas. The range starts at 5 years in prison all the way up to life in prison because I think our court system recognizes that there are things like heat of passion and spur of the moment type of killings, or things that would make a person rise to the emotional level to do that. But here, you have a planned out and kind of a methodical killing, and that is something that prosecutors definitely took into consideration with this case.
You talked about the sentences there in Texas, and the one I thought was really interesting is Holly's sentence. It was 2 life sentences. Obviously, she was involved in this. She's been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, but she didn't pull the trigger. She didn't stab anyone. Do you
Mhm.
think that sentence makes sense?
I think it's interesting to me that Mr. Beard's sentence isn't as strict or as harsh as hers, as he was the person that ultimately pulled the trigger and stabbed her. So and they're run concurrently. I'm sure that she has access to parole. They're not life without parole sentences, but again, I think it's warranted. But I mean, I think a lengthy sentence is warranted, but I don't know that it needed to exceed Mr. Beard's.
One thing's for sure about this case, it's a devastating one. I mean, the little girl lost both her mother and father in one fell swoop. It's really a tough one to cover. But Anthony, thank you for coming on and breaking it down with us.
Thanks for having me, Sierra.
In May 2023, nearly 1 year after he admitted to killing her, Andrew Beard was sentenced to 43 years in prison. As for Holly Elkins, authorities arrested her a month later and charged her with conspiracy to commit murder, stalking, and using a dangerous weapon. She was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.